placard for the Black folks inside of this crisis and this epidemic to know where resources are designated for them. And the basis of that should be, since we all know the data, we should have protocols in place that are being developed specifically for the most impacted group, so that we're not just regurgitating, the talking point and then pushing them into some type of, and people don't actually get a result that's different from what they've been seeing the entire time. The problem that I'm trying to figure out and that I want everybody to address is, where is the priorities or the prioritization of the African-American or the ADOS community in particular when it comes to resources? And are we taking this time to build new infrastructure? Because we've clearly seen that we weren't ready. And we've clearly seen that the community has been lacking, and we know why they're lacking. So what are we doing within our capacities to actually push resources inside of the professional capacities we have in order to build new infrastructures, to create infrastructure where none is?
Well, Nick, I would, some of the things that I'm seeing, and hearing are around, some churches really trying to step up, at least internally within their membership, to think about mutual aid. I think that this is a really sort of challenging time, and I think sort of calls the question in terms of the historic role of the Black church. And being a pillar within the community, and tending to folks' human needs and basic needs, in addition to their spiritual needs. So that's something that
I want to make sure we're clear, though. No, what are the agencies doing to prioritize? We know the church's role.
Well, but what are you talking? But I'm trying to respond, Nick, to your statement or question around, like, what does community infrastructure look like, right? And you kind of pointed to folks who are standing up.
Clear. I want to know what these agencies are doing to prioritize African-American descendants of slaves. That's what I want to know.
They aren't marked to do anything. So I feel like it's all in the community's hands. They're not assigned to do anything. That's not the focus, is to rebuild our community. So it is all in the people's hands, I believe.
Can I comment?
Yeah.
And again, I'm speaking for myself. As an elected official, right? When you're elected, you're not elected to only represent one group. So if you're coming up with strategies, you got to come up with specifics that make the most sense for each community, but you got to reach out to the community to ask them what that is, right? So one of the things that the health department has done, like I said, was to create that shared power advisory community, which is a diverse group of people, but includes members of the African-American community, right? Or descendants of slaves, right? So then they can tell the leaders what we need. And part of what we did too, as far as the community engagement branch of activation, was go out into the community. I spent some time with other outreach workers out going to specific locations within the north side and on the south side that were identified as needing some additional outreach, to talk about social distancing, to ask the owners if they're getting the communications from the city, to see if there's like an additional follow-up that needs to happen as far as procuring thermometers or having some additional guidance from or inspections from the health department. I know that's not as robust as I'd like to see it to be, but the idea behind the Shared Power Committee is that they will work in collaboration with the community, figure out what the community is doing and try to elevate the things and the strategies that are working that the community has identified and put into place themselves. I think, what happens if leadership tries to do it, especially if that leadership isn't representative enough of the community, is come up with strategies that may not work. So the idea is try to bring the community into that conversation so we know what's going to work and we can help support that. And me, myself, I recognize that as a leader, I represent a whole bunch of people in Brooklyn Center. Even in my own family, my daughters are Native, they're Black. I got cousins that are Mexican. So I am thinking about everybody when I respond, but I'm also thinking about the different strategies that work for different groups. And sometimes they don't always look the same, but if you want to know what they are, you have to ask them and include them in that process.
Okay, so let me be clear about something, because I understand the rhetoric. What I'm basing this on is, we all said that we understand the data. The data before this actually showed that every social economic metric for the African-American community placed us in dire needs already. When people talk about what the role of government and they dismiss the role of government, you don't understand that as this small little barely 350,000 member Black group, we pay $4 billion into the state of Minnesota. The cities get pieces of that money, county agencies get pieces of that money, and the state government gets pieces of that money. What we get in return is nowhere near adequate. And the annual rate is around 3.2 to 4 to $5 billion annually. So when I'm not talking like we're looking for a handout. We've already paid the government agencies, state agencies, county agencies, but the money is not being distributed proportional to what we were contributing. So we got to be educated as far as what we're talking about. So we got to make sure that if we're talking about what specifically is going into the African American slave community, it's not because we're saying that there is a old need or it's just some type of feeling. This is based on the tax bracket, our population, and what we're actually contributing. What we're putting in is nowhere near adequate to what we're getting out. And now we're in the middle of a crisis. And before the crisis, we were to face the disparities in the state, the largest disparity, and we already know all of this. If we know this, why is it so difficult for us to swallow the fact that, one, we haven't been doing a good job of addressing the ADOS community. Two, we actually have to call out this community by name in policy, in action, in finance. That's what I'm trying to get to. So I'm just trying to be clear. I don't want people thinking that this is about anybody else. We didn't call this as the multicultural thing. This is the Black Civic Network Community Town Hall. And the people that are here might not have the information that we do, which is why we take the approach that we take.
Hear you. I totally hear you, Nick. I'm just wondering, because you're asking me what structures are in place. And I'm wondering what structures do you think should be in place? You know, we have to hear from the Black community to know what that is. And I mean, me and my role.
That's a different question.
Yeah.
So I'll let everybody else go and I'll bring it back because I can go. I don't want to just.
Well, no, Nick, what I hear you saying is, what are we doing to allocate resource that is in a way that is reflective of the disparities that are creating the conditions under which African Americans are most at risk to wind up suffering from COVID. I mean, that's really kind of the bottom line, right?
Right.
Can I state something? So in this crisis, like groups like NAACP, is there a crisis situation, kind of like how the government has their own like pandemic crisis crew? Does any of the forms that we have since we've been funding or however or is that, because I definitely feel the preparation thing, the preparation isn't, we weren't really prepared for that. And speaking as a whole, it is about what do we do about that? And I think we're asking the same questions to each other.
So let me say, I think what Nick is pointing out to, and I think what April is hinting to, April just hasn't said it, is she answered your question. NAACP stands for National Advancement of Colored People.
Right.
When folks are talking people of color, they don't come in talking about African Americans. They talk about every other group across the spectrum. So what April is saying is if she's dealing with ACER, she knows who ACER represents. When she's dealing with these other immigrant groups, they come in talking about who they represent. African Americans fully, I should say, I want to say naively, right? I don't want to call them foolish, but naively believe that because you represent all of these groups, when they're at the table, they got your best concerns for you. And when we've sat in the meetings in the state, and we sat in meetings in county and city meetings, and we noticed that we've been locked out of a lot of these conversations. And everyone that's here, they've heard the conversations and the concerns as well. And they know when these other groups come to the table, they don't mention us. I've sat in meetings inside of Brooklyn Park with brother, I think brother name, but they were doing something on education. They named every African immigrant group, but they never mentioned African Americans whatsoever. It's not a concern of theirs. So what we're trying to do during this pandemic, and this is why it's an exposure, we are exposed. So your question is already answered by April. I think what April is saying is we can't know what the Black community wants or ADOS community wants if ADOS leadership doesn't stand up, step to the city, step to the state, step to the county and says, this is what we solely want for our communities. And they have to be able to do it unapologetically. And I think that is part of the problem. And that's why no one is prepared, because you can't be prepared if you're trying to cast a wide tent and everyone else don't want to be under the tent with you in the first place. The one foolish thing that we forget as African Americans in this country is that everyone else came to this country to be white. Nobody came here to be black, period. It goes to the caste system. Nobody wants to be black. So if you believe because they dance like you, because they wear their hair like you, because they can dress like you or anything else that they want to be like you, you are foolishly mistaken. And you don't see scholarships for you to go back overseas for you to learn over at their universities. You don't see scholarships for you to go back over there and buy their homes. That is a myth. That's a myth in your own mind. And so that's something that we have to grapple with, the reality of what happens to us inside of our communities. But the reason why we brought these people on, and I just want to mute you real quick because we want to make sure that the panelists, you can type any question you want inside of the chat, right? We want to make sure that we let them be heard. But the reason why we asked them this question was because we want the community to understand it's not really the role of government to organize you, right? But we have to ask them these questions so that we understand on the reflective side, you can't take the government works for you. You don't, you know what I'm saying? That's the whole role. They're called public servants. They serve the public. So the public has to step up and make those demands. The public has to organize and say, hey, Ms. Graves, when you become county commissioner for District 1, we want to make sure that you know that inside of Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, et cetera, this is what we need for our community directly, right? We have to put the pressure on her. Or we say, hey, Sonia, you decide that you want to run for city council inside of Minneapolis. We need you to know inside of Minneapolis, this is what we need for the African-American community. We don't want you to say when we're building a charter school that you can't say that this is solely for African-American students while we have a Hmong immersion school inside of our community. Doesn't make sense. You can't tell us no and then tell everybody else yes, and then hold us out of resources. So I think that's where Nick is coming at. I was waiting for another question in the chat, but since nobody is asking the questions, I'll ask another one. Oh, go ahead. No.
Oh, Thomas, let me speak to that for a minute, because I think if you can't tell from our answers from those of us who work within government, right? We constantly look to community leadership, and we can only push as far as community is pushing us in creating political space to really try to put together votes and put together policy that's going to deliver on the needs that you're laying bare, right? So, we would love to be able to sit here and come here into this space and say, as unapologetically as BCN is, like, this is what we're doing for the Black community, right? But the realities of politics don't allow us to specifically do that. But BCN and the folks who you work with on this call absolutely have that luxury to push us, right? And I think there's a quote from President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where he was talking to some African-American leaders at the time, right? And he's like, I agree with everything that you're saying. Now go make me do it, right? And so we're pushing and we're doing the inside game to try to do it. Right. But that only happens in partnership with community organizations like BCN that give us the fuel, the energy, right, that's needed to push policymakers who might not necessarily be in the same headspace or in the same space as, political allies and staff. So, the work that you're doing and the things that you're highlighting, I think are really, really, really key. And the other thing too that I'll point to, and I was kind of speaking to this earlier, is that community infrastructure has to be a part of sort of the triangle or the stool that we're thinking about when it comes to meeting community needs, right? So if we have a one-legged stool that is solely dependent upon government, there's no way that that's going to prop up, right? But if organizations like BCN, the Black Church, Black business leaders, right, are all a part of the legs on that chair, on that stool, in terms of the policy push and how we're organizing and delivering resources, then that's how we build the most secure base to specifically advance the interests. It cannot rely solely on government for a whole bunch of, real hard political realities. But if we're a part of a teammate in a solution that's community driven, I think that ensures that we get the most impact out of the public dollars that Nick very rightly points out you already paid in to the pool that should be serving our community more.
Appreciate that. I appreciate that. So I think Nick kind of already talked about the leading statistical categories of ADOS that we're lacking. Do you guys know, as far as, because I know you guys posted some of the resources, are there any other measures, like what's going to be, because my fear, just like in 1818, 1918, when they had the Spanish flu, people went back to work too early, and then it was a second wave, right? What happens? Are you guys planning a long-term contingency plans inside of your departments for just in case, if they tell us all, hey, go back and forget the social distancing, go back to high five and drinking and having fun. If this breaks out again, are you guys planning long-term plans on side of the state, city, and county levels at all?
I would say yes. This is Sarah. I would say we're even in Ramsey County, we have to, budgets are set up a certain way, right? So now we're having to look at our fiscal reality, and also not only just like right here, short term, but long term, and the impacts of that. And so I would say this pandemic is going to teach us a lot about our agencies and our infrastructure and our systems, right? And how we respond. And so my hope is that we still urge the state to start measuring, right, in our local governments to measure the outcomes, but we also take a look at that and say, how do we do business differently, right? How do we, this is like forced change, right, as we speak. And so I think that long-term, Ramsey County, hopefully will take a look at the impact that happened here, and also long-term, if we're preparing, right, that emergency preparedness model, getting into that frame of mind of how you respond to communities, the needs of communities, really proactively and not reactively. I think that that's happening, and we're forced into that space in so many different ways, not only fiscally and operationally, but logistically and even planning wise. And so it's going to change, I think, how hopefully it will have a positive impact on how we do business and how that impacts community long term.
So I have a question from two people. One is asking how we getting funds to the poverty-stricken Black families who don't have luxury of computers and laptops. A lot of them have to move. Those are the people that probably can't afford social distancing. And then the other is, how fast can these resources get into the hands of the community infrastructure if the solution is put on the table by the community? You know what? I'm gonna ask Noah to hop on that one first, because Sarah's running for office in the next 2 years. I'm gonna be her campaign manager. She just don't know yet. All right, go ahead, Noah.
And for the record, I already ran for office before, so been there, done that. In terms of the question around how are we getting information in the hands, so what we're looking at right now, and we're actively looking for opportunities to collaborate on this, but it's going old school, right? Like putting together flyers, with information that can contactlessly be put on people's doors. So we're working with our joint information center to have those materials. So if there are folks who want to do that work and just tape stuff to, like our elders' doors, or, other folks who, aren't going outside or are digitally disconnected, right? We're looking at partnering around that. Right now, we got the Bridge Fund going that Mayor Carter set up. Right. And, our goal is to make sure that information is getting into the hands of every single family and business owner, all the way to the micro entrepreneur who qualifies for the way that those funds have been set up. Right. So, we got materials on that, we want to tap into existing networks to make sure, that the word of mouth is happening around that. I am on my phone for this meeting, not my computer, so I'm not able to share links, but I'll share out the links here towards the end, or Thomas with you and with Nick afterwards. So, the other piece that I'll say too is that, and kind of piggybacking on Sarah's point, is that, this is a window where I think that there is a lot of opportunity to revolutionize how we're thinking about government. And to make some some policy changes. So Nick, you sent over some really good stuff, right? That talks about how are we thinking about, you know, the child support system? How are we thinking about housing provision? You know, how are we thinking about, you know, some of the different ways that, you know, we're doing fines and fees. So the things that we rapidly stand up in the face of a crisis from a policy standpoint, then the pivot becomes, right, that's the innovation point. And then the pivot becomes, how do we institutionalize those ways of doing things? Because what's being laid bare is that it wasn't a question of whether or not we could do it. It was just a question of urgency and importance and political will to make some of those things happen. So, you know, now is the time to press and to innovate, and then institutionalize, right, as we move back to whatever normal is going to look like.
All right, Sonia, you want to hop in?
No, I'm just actually just really agreeing with Noel, and I think that another thing that we should also think about is, you know, we do have the community that wants to be able to step up, but how responsive is the government in terms of how are we able to, you know, kind of institutionalize or operationalize some of the things that, some of the new policy proposals that the community may come up with. So there have, and I know that there have been some, government is very, the structure of government is just very, it's static and it's slower moving. So how can we be able to be more innovative, and how can we be able to kind of operationalize innovation when it comes to community wanting to do things different, and for us and for as government to be able to think about things different. So I'm just here, and I'm definitely agreeing with that as being a city government employee myself. I have come across different challenges on both sides of community and in government, and how are we able to be flexible on both sides to be able to push things and be more innovative.
Thank you. April, you want to chime in?
I really feel like Sonia did a good job saying what I was thinking. I think, you know, in my experience in government, I've often been very frustrated by the slow pace of how things happen. I will say that, you know, after being on the city council for a few years longer, I respect it and understand it a little bit more than I did prior to being in office. Because sometimes if we're not really thoughtful and intentional about the decisions that we're making, we can have unintentional negative impacts.
Right.
That being said, I do think that a lot of the bureaucratic red tape is definitely an obstacle. And oftentimes I think that, I'm not even gonna say any names, but oftentimes I think personal narcissistic and egotistical personalities of people in leadership cause undue obstacles and slows down that process even more. So I think part of it would be identifying the policies and the procedures that really aren't working and that can be changed.
Right.
And then getting some political will behind changing those policies. And then in other situations, recognizing when a slower and more intentional approach is needed. But it's very dependent, I think, on the circumstance.
Absolutely.
I think April needs to challenge her opponents to more debates so that she can win this seat. But that's just my opinion. Any more questions in the chat? Because, you know, for me and Nick, we do this every day of our life. So we can rapid fire these questions off because this is what we do, but we do this for you guys. So if you have a question, feel free to type it in. Doesn't matter if you're from another agency or not. We want to know your opinion, you know, your questions, because right now we need to use this time to talk to the people who are sitting at the table. They're at the table, they're able to hear what's going on, and they're able to also tell you guys what's happening. And what happens a lot of times in our community, we go into it hoping and wishing instead of talking to people directly. You know, this is a great time for you to use Sarah, Sonia, Brother Noel, as well as April as resources so you can understand outside of the links how you can shape your own mind when you're dealing with some of these needs that you might have. One thing that I wanted to point out too, especially in the city of Minneapolis, it's gonna seem like I'm picking on them a lot, But we were talking about this a few times, is that that the mayor put $5 million for undocumented citizens, right? And we know undocumented typically means that you're here without authorization, right? Which also means illegal. But we noticed that when it comes time, if us as citizens came and said that in the African American or the ADOS community, we need $5 million to stop violence on the streets. We need $5 million to combat homelessness. We need $5 million to combat mental health, right? We know that it's going to take, it's going to take a large mountain for that to happen. How do we, in you guys' opinion as citizens, this goes back, how do we push back on, like, how do we come and communicate with departments and say, hey, if you can give them 5 million, why can't we get 5 million?
I don't know if I'm really gonna be able to answer your question exactly, but it made me think about the work of the Office of Violence Prevention that I do with Sasha Cotton. She leads that department, and the work that they've done around group violence intervention. And even myself at the health department, my focus is on teen dating violence and youth violence prevention. Both of those buckets of work are fully funded by grants from outside of the city. And more recently, I believe the city of Minneapolis, the police department was asking for an additional amount of money in the budget for the police department. And at some point the council decided to give that money to the Office of Violence Prevention to create actually the Office of Violence Prevention, where we've been doing an OVP fund, basically, that organizations can apply for funding to do boots on the ground violence prevention in the community. There was a big backlash, a lot of media attention, and residents who were upset that that funding did not go to the police department. They even felt like it was a cut to the police department, when in fact it was just not an increase of as much from the budget year before. So I think that's a good example of how policymakers have to try to balance their approach, and also the work that the staff does in their departments to actually get the funding from outside sources to do the work that they know is needed in the community. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but hopefully it gives you a little bit more understanding of the different dynamics that are kind of at play in the work that we're doing every day, working within government entities.
No, that definitely helps out, because I talked to Sasha. I was in a meeting with Sasha as well as the mayor after one of the homicides in the city, and I understand that they're underfunded as well. You can't, when you throw a couple $100,000 at $1 million and maybe hundreds of millions of dollars issue, you're not going to get results. The problem is when we do get resources as African Americans or ADOS, we ended up getting less resources, but they're expecting a lot more done for pennies on the dollar. And I feel like that's I think that's an unfair ask for our community, right? So it's like, in one end, you lock us out of the resources, but when you do decide to give us resources, you give us a pinch, and then you say, hey, I've given you $1, go ahead and win the Powerball, okay? That's kind of like what they're expecting. And Noel, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that as well inside of some of the departments that you guys are in. And maybe it's not coming from the elected officials. Maybe it is more of a citizen thing, right? No, could it be possible that that's kind of like what's demanded out of the broader society, if you will, the white society? Hey, if you give these Black folks money, they can get a little bit, but they better come back with large results. Is that some of what you guys hear?
Yeah, I think that, government isn't immune from some of the same things that happen within, the philanthropic community, and other sectors, right, where, it tends to be, highly scrutinized and very results driven, but what happens in government is, it's the only sector where, there's a public referendum on whether the leaders keep their job every so often, right? So that creates, some different dynamics in terms of the way that the conversation rolls out. One thing that I will highlight that's a part of my role is I help oversee the process in terms of the appointments to the various boards and commissions within the city of St. Paul that the mayor makes appointments to. So if you want to be at the table around, how we allocate our sales tax dollars to community businesses and community artists, if you want to be around the table in terms of, how we allocate money to city facilities, whether we're going to, stand up, a police or fire station, or we're going to stand up a new community center, in an area where we know that that a lot of us live, get at me in terms of, talking about what being at those tables looks like. Because, we oftentimes look at our policy, our elected policymakers like they're the one piece of the puzzle, but, there are all these different leverage points when it comes to how policy gets made. And, you may, some of the folks who are listening may never want to run for office, right, and go knock on a bunch of doors. And may never want to work in a government position. But what you can do is stand up and represent your community, at the table as part of, our capital improvement budget committee, or our human rights commission, or our sales tax and revitalization board. And Minneapolis and other local communities have those same spaces. And so, in terms of what kind of comes out at, like at the vote at the table of the council, oftentimes that's informed by those various boards and commissions that are making recommendations in terms of like, okay, this is how you should be slicing the pie, or, this is what you should be thinking in terms of a policy recommendation. So you wanted to lift that up because even as we move through emergency and as we head again back into whatever normal looks like, those same tables and leverage points are still going to be at play.
All right, so Sarah, I know you got a jet real quick. Can you make any tell the people something before you go, or what they can do during or after this pandemic is up?
Sure. So I think the most important role I'll tell this to people is that as a race and health equity administrators, to engage community and keep community voice constantly at the table and be that representative for community when I'm asked to be that at the county level. And so I would say right now, I want people to know, I think to Sonia's point around the fact that we are engaging community in that innovative aspect that you mentioned, Sonia, around how we design and implement our response to COVID-19. I'm going to keep repeating that. And so through our food and basic needs security work group, which I think Thomas and some folks that are on this call are engaged with, you can get engaged that way, because the recommendations, how it's supposed to go is those recommendations should inform how the operations is developed, right? How the systems are developed, who's engaged, who stays at the table. So I would say that's what we're doing for COVID-19, but we were doing that before then. And so we have the Health and Wellness Service Team, Racial Equity Action Team. I put my email address in the chat box, and we have a number of action teams that are popping up where we're engaging community and honing in on the very thing that Thomas and Nick have talked about this afternoon around targeted communities and the needs of communities, and making sure that we change our procurement policies, that we're paying attention to how we contract, or we're paying attention to how we practice, develop procedures, our policies, everything Noel and April mentioned this afternoon. And so we're really trying to deconstruct those things and reconstruct them. And I would say more than ever right now, we're giving ourselves permission to do that. And we had the permission before, but now more than ever, it's so important. And so please get in contact with me. I have my counterpart, Prince Corbett, is the Race and Health Equity Administrator for the other 3 service teams within Ramsey County. That's Safety and Justice, ECGI, which is Economic and Employee Development, and IPR, Information and Public Records. And so thank you for having me. And it was great to see everybody, familiar and new faces, my people. All right, take care.
I'll see you in a second.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so that's Sarah Holly. So I got some questions. I want to make sure I get these questions inside of the chat real quick before everybody go. Brother Adrian Mack from Black Family Blueprint, he asked if there is—
Hey, Rico, I got it. Let me ask you real quick so I can bring some clarity to it. And I wanted to thank Sarah. I know she's already off, for being able to be on. Thank you, Noah, April, and Sonia for representing the systems in that way. And we value your opinion and perspectives on this piece. And my only question at this point now is, what type of pressure do we need to put on as community in order to expedite some of the needs and necessities of ADOS families right now, given the fact that this pandemic has exposed so much, and seeing how the process, the bureaucratic process, kind of gets weighed down in all this litigating meetings and all of these processes and all of these conversations that have to happen in order to serve the needs of ADOS families. What do you see, Noah, April, Sonia, from your perspective, that we need to do to bring some heavy pressure to move some and generate some energy quicker to meet the immediacy of our families in the community? What do you see on your end that has to happen from us to be able to move this thing in a more fundamental and radical way?
You know, I want to thank you for that question, because you know, that's as I was saying earlier, that's really what it's going to take to continue to really press in the critical moment, you know, for what we think can be some lasting changes. You know, I think some of the work that BCN has been doing, that Nick shared with me, in terms of saying, here are very specific things, right, that are pinch points, pain points, critical needs for change, in terms of policy, administration, or resource need. So bringing those forward, and with that level of specifics, so that we can bring that in front of decision makers, and try to work within some of the accelerated timetables that are happening right now to make those changes happen. So, you know, you all, you know, are you know, living it. We all know folks who are living it, but you all are working directly day in, day out with the folks, you know, who are experiencing it, living it, maybe living it, experiencing it yourselves. So, you know, just keep that information flowing in terms of the specific things that we need to be looking at. And, you know, quite frankly, as was said earlier, you know, nothing is different in terms of the needs for change that were there, that are there now, that were there before COVID. So, you know, I know it may be frustrating because it feels like, okay, this is the same thing we've been lifting up, right, for the past year, the past 2 years, the past 5 years. But you know, it's again, taking advantage of this window to make changes that have been needed for a very long time. Because again, the changes that you see government making, they're nothing new in terms of what's been needed. So it's just that there is the window, the willingness there. So keep coming with those specific ideas.
April? I'm sorry, Sonia. I'm gonna let you go last, Sonia. You can finish it out.
Okay.
Yeah, my first thought was like specific solutions. You know, I think that we all kind of know what the issues are, where the gaps and the disparities are. And I think we can get sort of stuck in a circle just talking about what's missing and what's not working, but we really need to think about what is working. And I think if you have solutions, those are the things that you should be putting forward and pushing on. I don't even pretend to know what all the solutions are, because I'm just one person. I have some ideas. If I hear something from the community, I try to push it up the chain of the command and say, here's a story about what's working in the community on the ground. How can we work with these people in this community better? And I think that that's really what needs to happen. A lot of the time, it's not the what, it's the how. How can we do it with equity? How can we do it being intentional and making sure that it works for the people that we're saying it's supposed to work for? I think oftentimes it's the how that becomes the confusing part, not always even the what. So the solutions that you have and how they could be best implemented in partnership is what they need to hear, and how that will actually impact the disparities that you were pointing out in the first place. I mean, make the case basically for your own solution.
And now Sonia.
Well, I mean, I definitely would agree with the fact that we need to, as a community, we need to really be able to make those recommendations and proposals known. I know for specifically, you know, the city of Minneapolis supports small businesses. They have a small business team that supports in terms of like technical assistance. And I believe that that is not just a service that's provided by the city, but it's also a line of communication. And so when we're talking about small businesses not necessarily getting the types of assistance from the federal government that is needed in terms of like paycheck protection or grants instead of like versus just loans, right? I believe that the small business team with the city of Minneapolis is also like a line of communication, and so that there are some things that have come up with the city of Minneapolis being able to support small businesses and self-employed people. There are more opportunities of gap funding out there, and it's there because of the small business that the city of Minneapolis is already supporting. There are opportunities for gap funding for self-employed and for small businesses that employ under 20 people, right? Or less than $1 million of annual revenue. And because there is already that line of communication that's open with the community and the city of Minneapolis, there have been some, I would say some communication that went up the ladder and said, well, what about small businesses? What about, gap funding for us? We don't want just loans. But so now there are opportunities for forgivable loans for small businesses, or and also for revamping loans from 2% to 0%, and offering some more flexible things. And that's because that line of communication is already there. And so I think that it's really important for the city to be able to offer direct lines of communication with the community, but also the community needs to be able, they can be able to use that line to be able to say, hey, what we need to be able to have some different things here, and not just what the federal government is offering. It's great, but we need some other things. And so I think that that's also an opportunity of where community and city government can be able to work together to offer some different things and try to relax upon some policies and some programs and some initiatives that may have been somewhat static or rigid before, to be able to offer some innovation and some proposals that offer innovation and creativity and flexibility that community needs.
Well, I just want to thank all four of you, April Graves, Brother Noel, Sister Sonia, as well as I almost forgot her name, Sister Sarah. I want to thank you guys for your time. I want to thank everyone else who's also in the chat. I do agree with Brother DC. On our end as a community, I think it will take a Black collective for these things to move, and we have to be united. That's why we call ourselves ADOS, because that term Black doesn't necessarily just mean Black. Just for those people out there listening, when we talk about businesses and gains, a lot of times we're thinking it's us. Some of the data shows that it's not us. It's our brothers and sisters from the continent who are making some of those financial gains and some of those gains in education. It's not our children. It's not our women. It's not our men. We are under the guise because everybody is placed under this thing called Black, that everyone is working for this thing called Black. No, Black is only a term that's used inside of the United States. When people go back to their home countries, they're known by their tribes, or they're known by the nationalities that they're from, but they're not known as Black. Only in this country are you Black. So I want to say this to our people that's listening once again, you have to change your mindset. When people come to this country, they're put in the bucket of Black, white, or what have you. But when they go home, they're not thinking that they're Black. They know that they're Black when they want to go down to the county and they talk to a Sarah and they want to get some Black dollars. Or if they're at the city level and they're saying for mental health, they might be talking to April and they might say Black. But when they go into their communities, they're saying, no, I'm Igbo. They're talking tribal talk, right? So we have to understand that as a community and stop thinking that everyone else is going to the table speaking on our behalf. We have to speak on our own behalf. We have to utilize on our own. And if we don't, when the next pandemic come around, it's going to be worse for ourselves, and we're going to see less and less. And you can't blame the people who are working on the county, city, and state levels for these things. We have to, as Brother Noel said elegantly, what was said to Roosevelt, we have to force them to do it. We have to make them do it. Brother Nick Muhammad, I know you want to close us out, so let me bring you back in.
Yeah, again, thanks to the panel, April, Noel, Sonia, Sarah. We appreciate the work that you all are doing, your accessibility, you all stepping in and literally giving a face to some of these agencies and some direct connections for the community so that people can have some peace of mind. Appreciate all of the resources that you all brought to the table. And I'm encouraging everybody to definitely pass those resources around and get in contact with them via the emails and the contacts that they put out. This conversation definitely isn't going to stop today. And we're encouraging people to make sure that, to Thomas's point, we have to be selfish at this point as a community. That's what a part of the problem has been. There's nothing wrong with making sure that the ADOS community has its oxygen mask on before it starts helping everybody, right? So we got to make sure that we're proud of that. We're going to continue these conversations Tomorrow, we're going to be heading up with education. And Thomas, I know you got all the details on that. So just make sure that you all continue to tune in. Let's share this conversation. And again, thank you all for providing that information for us.
And yes, tomorrow at 1 p.m., we will be having an education panel. We have a principal as well as a director from a charter school. We have one of the principals on the school board. Actually, we have the chair of the school board of Minneapolis Public Schools, and she'll be on. We have a couple of other teachers and someone who's running for vice president of the teacher union inside of Minneapolis. She'll be on. So we have
Thomas, real quick, I just want to tell you that I do have some resources and some websites, but I'm on my phone right now. And so I will send those that information to you to post.
Please send it to me. And then what I'll do is I'll post it on the BCN page, and we want everyone to share. If you haven't liked the BCN page, please do that. One last thing, because Nick brought it up again. That is the thing. We have to be selfish at this moment, and it's okay being selfish. It just means to self-sustain. Make sure that you are sharing that information that you receive, but also utilizing it for yourself. We can't be talking about helping anyone else before we help ourselves, and especially in this pandemic, because if you got that virus, you can't help anyone else, right? If you don't have anything to eat in your home and you're just trapped in your home, then your home becomes a prison. So we have to take this time now to mobilize ourselves mentally. That's why we had the physicians and the people with nutrition on yesterday. We gave you the people with the resources today. Tomorrow we'll be dealing with the babies and education. And on Thursday at 1 p.m., we'll have the community activists, faith leaders, and others on so we can talk about this. And like I pointed out, and Noel brought this up too, I want to say this again. The Black churches have been taking a major hit, right? And I'm saying this, I'm not a Christian. The Black churches have been taking a major hit in our community for years. But we have to tip our hat to these members or these leaders who have went out of their way to make sure that food was being able to be provided for the communities, as well as other supplies during this time. That is a institution that we as Black folk, we can control that institution. All we have to do is put ourselves inside of that pot. Those places that we frequent a lot, I'll say like I said yesterday, I haven't heard the Gold Room give any of y'all any food. I haven't heard of the Breakfast Bar giving any of you guys food. I haven't heard of any of these places that we frequent, we brag about, we pass along, we talk about all day long. They haven't given you a darn thing. So you might want to start looking at some of these elders that you've been arguing with over the past few years and ask them to pass on some of that wisdom, and then get into those institutions so we can carry it on for our babies. This is a time that we need to reboot, reset, and we've been exposed. We're like the emperor with no clothes on. So it's time for us to get some garbs and put them on ourselves so we can be dressed for the next pandemic. Appreciate you all for coming on once again. Appreciate you all for listening. Love you all. Stay safe. And once again, be selfish. This is for us. And, those other groups, they're going to be selfish too, and they're going to work themselves out. You guys be easy. Thank you.
Thank you.